WhiteSource was one of our first security partners to integrate their software composition analysis into GitLab CI. With WhiteSource, you can scan more languages and enjoy many other benefits that they bring while seamlessly providing actionable results to the developer through the GitLab merge request pipeline. WhiteSource is also integrated into the GitLab security dashboard. Now here, the security team gets much earlier visibility into application risk while also getting on the same page with the developers. For details, check out the WhiteSource webpage on GitLab integration. Now, welcome Rhys Arkins with WhiteSource.
Hi, thanks everyone for joining. Let's continue the security discussion today by talking about DevSecOps and reducing context switching in open source security. Now, as many of you hopefully saw, maybe even participated in, GitLab released its 2020 DevSecOps survey results recently, and I was interested in this question, particularly about how nearly half of the respondents were not willing to classify their current security efforts as good or better. This is perhaps a good thing though, because it's never a good idea to be overconfident with security, but it does raise the question of what does good security look like? What would it take to answer good or strong to that question? So today I'm going to dive into that topic while focusing in particular on open source security. So first of all, when it comes to security, I want to make it really clear that it's never a good idea to neglect parts of it. However, I do want to emphasize the importance of open source security in this discussion. And this is because of the so-called iceberg effect. In the typical application, this might be your website, it could be an API server. In your typical application, the majority of code that you ship is actually open source code that you have imported into your project one way or another. Now, with open source code, to you it might seem like, of course, someone else's code, and therefore maybe someone else's responsibility. But to the end user, the end customer, everything you ship is yours and it's your responsibility. So what that means is that security problems in open source also become your responsibility. Now, if it wasn't for that, there's one thing that also makes it particularly important, and that is the effect that happens when security problems are discovered. Now, if you make a mistake or an accident in code that you write, you might even be so lucky that neither you nor any of your colleagues ever discover it, or anyone who wants to do something bad. However, with open source vulnerabilities, i.e. mistakes in open source code that may lead to exploitable problems, once they are disclosed publicly, you really have no choice because the bad guys out there are already looking for ways to exploit it, potentially even scanning websites and APIs and so on. So open source security is something that you can't choose just to opt out of. So in general, this concept of open source security falls under a category known as software composition analysis, or SCA for short. So SCA is fundamentally about knowing exactly what open source components go into the software that you ship, and also being confident that you will be alerted if there are any security or, say, licensing problems with the open source dependencies that you're using. This is the core of SCA. Now, at WhiteSource, we're proud to be the market leader in SCA. We're a big believer in open source, and our goal is that everybody can use open source freely and fearlessly. However, we don't mean the type of naive fearlessness that a toddler has walking into traffic. We're talking about a mature, informed fearlessness to ship code that depends heavily on open source and be confident that you are on top of your security and licensing issues. Now, in this Forrester report, you'll also see GitLab already making waves in Q2 last year. Now, GitLab as a full DevOps platform is uniquely positioned in many ways for SCA, and its capabilities, GitLab's capabilities, combine extremely well with WhiteSource's to present a joint solution that benefits users of both solutions. So this is what we're going to focus on today. Now, back to this term DevSecOps, putting the security in DevOps. Now, the mantra of DevSecOps, which you've no doubt heard before, is shift left. So, but what does shift left really mean? Now, the theory of shift left is that developers are taking over responsibility for security. But the reality is, if we don't change anything except for our mantra, then nothing in reality will change. So in practice, what this really means is that we need to equip developers with visibility and tools for security that they need in order to adequately take over that security role. All right, so if we look at shifting left, drilling down a bit more, traditionally shift left came from the software development lifecycle idea that the earlier you catch something, the cheaper it is. You may see people sometimes say it's like a 10x cheaper in development than testing, 10x in testing rather than production. I mean, obviously this varies a lot. But with SCA, we have a little bit of a conundrum here because most of the problems in open source security actually occur in dependencies that you're already using, which actually usually means in production. So no amount of shifting left in the development lifecycle can kind of prevent those types of problems from happening. So we know that there will be production vulnerabilities, almost for certain. And we know that developers are best positioned to own that process, to upgrade or roll back or even potentially remove vulnerable dependencies if there's no other choice. So in that context, shifting left means visibility and tooling to developers in order to be able to do that as quickly as possible. So the WhiteSource and GitLab integration takes that a step further, which I call, or I like the term in-context security. So what this means is that these tools that developers need to be responsible for security are not just available, but they're part of their day-to-day workflows to avoid context switching. And for a developer, their day-to-day workflow is in GitLab. So let's just center this discussion a little on the GitLab platform first. Again, you've probably seen this graphic. I include it here because I think it's fundamentally important that GitLab sees security as a first-class component of their DevSecOps platform. And in fact, GitLab was the pioneer in elevating security in source control. So let's zoom in on that GitLab Secure category. All right, so here you can see the details of that category that I showed. And you'll see there's around 7 or 8 security categories or security components, some of which fall under this category of software composition analysis, but also some which are non-SCA, like SAST and DAST and fuzzing. So this holistic coverage of security capabilities is very important. But today, I'm going to focus on 2 here. It's dependency scanning and vulnerability management, because these are the focus of WhiteSource's integration with GitLab. First, though, a little side analogy. I think that personal health is a great analogy for software security. Now, people are not unhealthy in life because they lack awareness of the benefits of being healthy, nor even of the broad steps required in order to be healthy. After all, we all know that healthy food and exercise is a really good idea. Being unhealthy, though, for many of us is also not about a lack of intention either. I mean, most of us want to be healthy. So the main challenge for people in terms of healthy versus unhealthy is whether we've adapted the practices we need to remain healthy into our daily routines. Now, software security is very similar to this because these days developers know the benefits of secure software. I'd say most developers even know a lot of the specifics about producing secure software, and especially about open source security. So the big missing link is security being part of a software developer's routines and their day-to-day workflows. Or like we've been saying, that it's in context for them. So one of the biggest problems facing security adoption today is that security is not integrated enough into how developers build software. And so with the WhiteSource and GitLab integration, we want to make that not the case. We want to bring open source security deeply into the developer workflow. So, as you know, we can with a siloed security solution like the type WhiteSource could build on its own, we can do many things. So, we can scan repositories, we can match against vulnerabilities, we can even create alerts. But what we can't do is make sure that people look at them, care about them, or take action on them. So, if your approach, and it's a mistaken approach, if your approach is to try to lead developers to security, especially siloed security, to lead them to security is a little bit like leading a horse to water. You can't necessarily make the horse drink, and you can't make people care about security or pay attention to it if it's not part of their daily workflow. So with that, WhiteSource shifted left to partner with GitLab. So what this means from our point of view is that we bring our alerts and our remediation capabilities for open source vulnerabilities inside GitLab. We want to bring actionable data in line with workflows developers already use, or if it can't be in line, then one click away. And also we want no context switching. We want to reduce ultimately the time to resolution for open source vulnerabilities. So like GitLab itself, WhiteSource capabilities can somewhat be split between the dev persona and the security professional persona. So first up, let's dive into the details of WhiteSource's developer tools integrations with GitLab. So the first point that we wanted to achieve was automated scanning. We don't want developers to need to think or remember about security. It needs to be automated. So for example, having to remember to insert a manual pipeline for WhiteSource into every new project is something that can be forgotten, and it's friction. So the goal is to have WhiteSource automated and ever present within the GitLab deployment. Now, we do this by listening to system hooks. This allows us to know every time code's been committed and to scan on every commit. So we call this part of our WhiteSource for Developers solution, and it runs in containers, including Kubernetes. I want to point out, because sometimes people get confused, that the WhiteSource for Developer solution runs side by side or independently of GitLab and not in pipelines, as I mentioned before. This way it can queue up scanning results and report those results when they're ready. We leverage WhiteSource's cloud database, which contains terabytes of security and licensing data about open source. And this is ultimately how WhiteSource for Developers integrates in with GitLab. Receive system hooks, perform a scan. Now, the next thing we wanted to achieve was continuous or real-time monitoring. Now, of course, we want to be able to run every time there is a commit, because that might mean new dependencies and new vulnerabilities. But also, there are times in a software project where there can be a long time between commits. It might be weeknights, it might be weekends. So in order to combine the best of pipeline scanning with WhiteSource's real-time alerting, the way our combined integration works is that cross-referencing is done in real time. So therefore, yes, results are scanned every time there is a commit and referenced against the database, but also the WhiteSource database, every time it receives a new vulnerability, it cross-references that against the metadata of every project. So what this means is that, if you don't have commits on a weekend, but a very nasty vulnerability is disclosed, you don't have to wait until the next commit on a Monday to receive it. Instead, that vulnerability will be reported in real time. So all of this can be achieved without any changes to the workflows or pipelines for existing GitLab users. The next point is inline feedback. Now, if you give security feedback in a separate siloed system, it'll often get forgotten. It also is an unnecessary friction caused by that context switching. So our goal was to display WhiteSource data and alerts in line whenever we could, especially in places where developers are already looking. So in this screenshot here, you can see there is a red commit on top and a green commit below that. This represents, pass or fail, just like usual. And if you drill down into the failed check, you'll see the report below that. And what this does is gives quite detailed information about CVEs and severities and so on. Now, the idea of this is that if a developer makes changes, particularly in a merge request, that introduce vulnerabilities into the system, that they'll be alerted immediately and can one-click get the rich detailed information that they need to, hopefully correct that mistake. Okay. Now, you may recall I mentioned earlier that with open source vulnerabilities, you're almost certainly going to end up with production vulnerabilities, no matter how good your practices are. What this means is that we can't be sure that every vulnerability enters our system through a merge request and can be caught in a pipeline. Many of the vulnerabilities are going to be in dependencies we're already using in our base branches. Now, what this means is that we need another way to alert GitLab users to security issues that are found asynchronously or unrelated to pipelines with that real-time alerting. So for this, we adopted confidential issues to again mean that there's no context switching required for developers using the GitLab system. So this means that if there are 10 outstanding vulnerabilities, we can create 10 confidential issues, giving great detail on all of the things wrong, caused by that CVE. Something I'd like to point out as well is that the issue creation is optional. I know that some people don't have issues enabled on projects. It is possible to disable them and even to use other issue systems like Jira. But for the ideal low no context switching, GitLab issues are the best way to raise awareness to developers. Okay. So alerts and issues are great, but resolving the problem with one click is even better. So a key enhancement of WhiteSource's solution is extensive remediation capabilities for open source vulnerabilities. So WhiteSource for developers can raise automated merge requests that provide the exact change required to remediate vulnerabilities that are found in a base branch of a project on a GitLab hosted project. So this means that instead of developers having to, read reports and it says, okay, update to version 1. Or 2.1.6 or something like that. Instead of that, you actually get a merge request almost immediately that you can, of course, run through your regular pipeline checks and merge with one click, assuming that it all passes. The language support here is quite extensive. JavaScript, Java, PHP, .NET, Python, Ruby, and Golang so far. And another nice feature is that if you're using both merge requests and issues, is that the merge request will confirm to you which issues that the merge request fixes or closes. Now, as a final step in our developer focus tools, we leverage a feature of GitLab's Gold and Ultimate tier called Pipeline Security. And what this does is this gives positive feedback on the merge requests that we create, enabling developers to have like a double confidence in the remediation merge requests that WhiteSource creates. So of course, in the first instance, it's an automated merge request and it lists which CVEs and issues are being resolved, but also to give additional confidence, the scan is rerun on the new branch and it is confirmed using the pipeline scanning that the vulnerabilities are indeed resolved there. So again, we want to reduce that time to resolution. So making it one click and a very high confidence is the best way to achieve that. Okay, so continuing into Gold Ultimate discussion, I want to talk now about the security dashboard of GitLab. So again, as I mentioned, it is almost guaranteed that any medium to large software project is going to have open source vulnerabilities in production, okay? So the dashboard, therefore, the security dashboard, I mean, is additionally useful for open source security because what this does is allow security teams to coordinate this quite pressing issue of vulnerabilities in production. So one of the key things about when vulnerabilities are in production and they're publicly disclosed is that urgent action is often necessary. So security teams need the ability to coordinate. They need to make sure the right people are notified. They need actionable information about this security threat. And finally, they need to be able to work with developers in order to remediate these problems. The security dashboard is a really great one-stop, all-inclusive security dashboard, including for non-SCA. As I mentioned earlier, there's SAST, DAST, token scanning, and things like that. So the security dashboard provides security professionals with a great view into all of the projects they have access to. This doesn't require them, for example, to be logged into multiple security products, including WhiteSource, as well as not needing to watch individual product and project issues. So one of the key things that WhiteSource brings into the security dashboard is as much actionable data as we can into the alerts. You can see here a screenshot of that. Now, if you've looked into security before, for example, if you browse the National Vulnerability Database, the NVD, where most vulnerabilities alerts come from, you probably would have been pretty surprised at how unstructured and confusing that data can actually be for the National Vulnerability Database. So at WhiteSource, we work to enrich as well as clarify every issue we can, or every vulnerability we can. And although we provide links to many external sources, such as the NVD, such as potentially to the issue or the merge or pull request where the issue was resolved, our goal is that the data that is provided to the GitLab security dashboard is both succinct as well as complete, allowing security professionals to make informed decisions without having to context switch out into multiple tabs, multiple sites, and so on. So wrapping up, here's the core of the GitLab and WhiteSource better together story. So shifting left, it needs to be more than just words or mantras. If developers are to take responsibility for security, they need the necessary data and tools in the context they operate, which is GitLab. And for GitLab users, the benefit of WhiteSource's integration is they can get market-leading open source security capabilities without the need for context switching or breaking with the single platform approach that makes GitLab's DevSecOps great. And finally, for WhiteSource users, GitLab's innovative security dashboard and pipeline security improve the experience even further. So thank you very much for your time today. I look forward to any questions or feedback you want to give. Will be in the chat, and you can give those now or in the future.